Okay, so this is going to be a bit of a strange recording, I guess, because I'm going to go through a gambit of different political issues and ideological issues. And the point of this recording, in some sense, is a bit of a plea or a bit of a directed advice for the DA. Um, but in some sense, I think perhaps also it could be seen as a political primer also for political parties like COPE as well, who I think are in an ideological space that's conducive enough for them to ramp up honesty or something like that. I do think that I worry about the DA. I worry about its kind of, I don't know how to put it, a kind of, that although it has committed itself openly to having the right principles and values, I think that in the wider ideological arena, in the wider ideological, to have a serious analysis of these things, that it's not enough to merely say the right things. You have to do something a bit more in order to be credible, in order to have a kind of authenticity in your message. And because of the nature of the political arena, the nature of the political space itself, this requires a certain kind of ideological escalation, which the DA seems much too tentative about wading into. And this reluctance comes off that its ideological position is inconsistent, that it's at odds with its own principal message, that it lacks the conviction or the authenticity. And I'm going to and there are good historical reasons for this as well. I mean, this is essentially the damage that the politics of Musi Maimane did to the party, and that damage still has not been recovered from, and not least because the DA itself has not distanced itself from Musi Maimane directly, only indirectly. It has changed the party line. Yes, it has done all these things, but it hasn't had. It's had. I mean, I see John Steenhuisen making insinuating this, that the DA learns from its mistakes and things like that, but it has not actually had a vocal watershed where it said we disown what we did in the last election cycle. In terms of Musi Maimane's campaigning, and in some sense, these are both two sides of the same coin, of the same issue, of the same problem, which is that how do you deal with toxic identity politics? How do you actually answer the kinds of political arguments that are made by the activists and promoters of identity politics? And you can see that, Musi Maimane's strategy, you can tell, was always going to be a losing strategy. When you watch the interview between Eusebius Makaisa and Musi Maimane in the run up to the 2019 elections. It really is worth going back and listening to that interview, um, and just looking at what you're basically looking at is you're looking at two black fascists deciding over how much retributivism is needed in order to essentially soothe the political landscape. And so you have and then you have Musi Maimane being, let's say, correctly identified as being inconsistent, or at least in terms of the sentiment that Musi Maimane is exuding. It seems incoherent. That well, he so he's misrepresenting land reform. Because he has to sort of join the course of the identity politics racialist narrative around this. So he really concedes so many principled points so that he can sort of agree with the premise of Eusebius Macaisa's fascistic questions, and not sort of re-evaluate and re Eusebius Macaisa is saying, in principle, let's just talk about the principle first. And this is where Musi Maimane really gets himself into hot water, because in principle he already has conceded essentially to the fascistic political line in identity politics. And now he is just trying to sort of control himself based on maximizing something that looks like some kind of libertarian sort of, rule of law kind of thing, but it's all fudged. It all doesn't make sense. And Musi Maimane's line in this is pathetic. I mean, it is disgraceful. Um, and the party, the DA party, has shrunken from Musi Maimane's position, but it has not attended to the questions and attended to the tone and the ideological accusatorial, sort of line of argument from Eusebius McKaiser. What could a modern what could John Steenhuisen do in an interview with Eusebius McKaiser? And I mean this as a thought experiment. How could you actually rebuff that kind of fascistic politics? How could you treat with those issues? And just ducking these issues is not enough. It's not good enough. It's not going to work. This is why the DA can't fulfill its oversight function, because it's been ideologically maligned. It's been indicted. It has ideological accusations. I mean, why would you listen to a party that wants to offer oversight, political oversight, when in some sense it's been pinned with the label of, the apologists of white monopoly capital, and it has no real retort to those kinds of labels. So if you just shrink away from your detractors, people are going to think that you're either inauthentic or that you lack credibility, and in either case, it must be regarded as true that you seemingly lack conviction in your own line to some degree, that there is some element of missing conviction. And especially when you're up against ideological opponents who use their own conviction as essentially a credential, and then they are pointing to the fact that there's no conviction on the other side. And on some level, you must concede that these people seem to have a point, on some level at least. They do seem to be the ones exuding conviction, and there's no conviction on the other side. Now, I would argue that the reason why. Now, look, I understand that this is playing with fire. It is difficult to do what I'm describing to do. It is not easy, but I do think that it is necessary. Now, this is necessary for a lot of reasons, because otherwise you're never going to recover the damage that was done by one can also say it was also done by Helen Ziller. Now, I believe that Helen Ziller has more than made up for her forays into identity politics. But again, I still think the DA needs a mea culpa. It needs a watershed moment, and it has done this in a telegraphed way. It's done this in an indirect way, but it hasn't done this in terms of its own line, in terms of its own. And I look, I understand that in the nature of politics, to sort of to concede something or to apologize, seemingly, is to show weakness or something like that, and it looks confusing or something like that, maybe to the outside, and to but I do think that there's a special circumstance of developing credibility, of developing authenticity and conviction, and the kinds of things that we're up against in South Africa need that level of conviction as well, because in some sense, there are wider things that need to be complained about, and in some sense, these things don't fit neatly into a political argument or into a political polemic. The kinds of things that need to be, I think, you need a political voice to make the kinds of critiques that I think need to be made about the institutionalized corruption of the constitutional law, the fact that we shouldn't be having a democratic debate over certain things that should essentially be non-negotiable, because they should be hermetically sealed by the limitations clause of the Constitution. That racialist legislation, for instance, should not have ever been allowed to become a political football. This should have been taken off the table by the courts. But the courts essentially have institutionally corrupted the constitutional jurisprudence. Now, in some sense, there can be a somewhat of a political solution to this, because they've made it a political issue now, and as that being the de facto lay of the land, you can just but there are ways, I think, to politically talk about this, and they need to be politically spoken of. I mean, and this also has a myriad ways in which it crops up in the current issue around expropriation without compensation. The idea that someone can actually campaign to have the rights in the Bill of Rights reduced, to have people's rights in the Bill of Rights removed from them and radically altered in order to section them out through an amendment. That amendment that would have to be made as an act of parliament should have to be funneled and filtered back through the limitations clause, because otherwise we don't have constitutional supremacy. At the point at which people are already campaigning to maim the Constitution, they have already committed an unlawful act. The amendment of the Constitution is there to improve it. It's not there to have things removed from it. It's there so that things can be added, not so that things can be subtracted. That is the function of constitutional amendment. To run it the other way, and also to bypass the limitations clause, is in some sense a deeply unconstitutional, but also, the idea that people, just because they are members of parliament, that somehow they are above the Constitution, this is not what we had a revolution for. We do not live in a democracy. We live in an open liberal democracy. These things are not the same thing. We live in a republic with constitutional supremacy. So if an amendment is going to subtract something from the Constitution, it has to go through the limitations clause. But in some sense, looking already at how the racialism has gotten by the subclauses of the limitations clause, the Constitutional Court has said that we're not going to apply the limitations clauses against black economic empowerment and affirmative action legislation, that there's a governmental prerogative. They made up this concept of a governmental prerogative so that they didn't have to actually apply the subclauses of the limitations clause. So they basically said, no, there are no substantive filters. There's democracy can just decide how it wants to do this. And therefore saying that essentially that non-racialism is up to be redefined by the democracy, that justice no longer, we don't have the rule of law, we don't have laws of general application, the Constitution is not in effect, essentially. It can be divested by the democracy. So that is an institutionalized corruption of the law. Essentially, our justice system has been subverted by political, planted, ideological, sort of partisan hackery. And this has happened through identity politics. It's happened through the so-called anti-racism version of redefinition of social justice. So all of these things are things that I think do need a political voice to them. And, when I see some of what the DA is doing, I'm not... okay, this is a complete tangent now, what I'm about to go into. and this is a kind of parallel sort of sideline, when I see that there's a debate over gender-based violence, and I see that the DA comes up, or people from the DA are making these. I must say, I'm not a great proponent of this activism around gender-based violence. I think um, feminism itself is a strange kind of it has a weird way of promoting the problem that it's complaining about, it, it, because it's not really actually focusing on any kind of preventative uh, uh, measure. It's always essentially creating a more hostile, a more agitated stereotype in people's minds as to what the problem is. And this makes it impossible to actually treat what the actual problem is. And, essentially, this is almost, when you see people talking about gender based violence, they're always sort of talking about this kind of, they're repeating these platitudes that come from essentially intersectional feminism and other kinds of identity politics type. It is often quite toxic and insoluble ways of framing problems. That you're just trying to divide everybody up into that you either buy into the ideological framing of the issue or you don't buy into the ideological framing, and then you need to be shamed and bullied until you join the solution or something like that. And somehow the solution just means believing in the right thing. Now, if you actually wanted to really do something about gender-based violence, it would all be about that you need to identify abusers before you marry them or before you get involved with them. That prevention is so much better than cure. And the reason why people don't actually want to do the actual real legwork of building towards prevention is because the culture and the gender politics itself has been fundamentally messed up, and it's toxic. And one of the reasons why it's toxic is because of feminism. Feminism, quite strangely, wants to have all the common stereotypes and traditional role of woman sort of reinvented in this double standards, in this weird paradigm in which, that, well, women need to have the same earning capacity as men do so that they're not trapped financially, and then subject to abuse. But so the economy must change in order to get women to have that kind of equal capacity and power. It's such an obtuse way of trying to just generalize the problem as a systemic oppression, and that we must all just try to turn up the heat and turn up the attention on the systemic oppression. This has no real solution. This just pumps up the problem in terms of demonization of all these different contributing factors, and it leads to what solution precipitates from this kind of framing of the problem? Nothing. So I would consider myself, let's say, the shadow of feminism, because I'll tell you what the real solution would be. The real solution would be is that women have to start taking more responsibility and accountability for the people who they get involved with. That in some sense, what makes a woman be attracted to an anima possessed man that will perform this kind of abuse? And I'll tell you exactly the kind of uh, social standards that make these kinds of men, what elevates them to this position of having this kind of power. But I mean, it's also, when you look at these kinds of dysfunctional arrangements, the women are very often not merely victims, they are always participants. And you can tell that then it was the quality of the relationship that they had themselves collaborating in generating some kind of codependency with an anima possessed man. And there's a reason why that there is some attraction to the anima possessed man, and it's essentially because there's a kind of psychopathology on the behalf of the woman. And this can often have essentially themes of there's a fundamental sort of disconnected ownership of any kind of responsibility, that as long as you can see yourself as being part of some kind of transaction, that you can just take a snapshot of that transaction and then you can leverage that. And women that like interfacing with men who therefore produce beautiful promises, beautiful snapshots, the emotionally uh, um, anima possessed men who are very emotionally temperamental have this capacity essentially to create these kinds of illusory uh, 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 images and essentially half baked um, pretenses and essentially mirages. They're very good at creating mirages and relying on mirages, and when those mirages themselves fail, that is when essentially you could see pathology and abuse then sort of start to rear its head. But what makes these kinds of men attractive to women in the first place? Now, I mean, obviously, there might be elements of essentially cycles of dysfunction which get replayed throughout many generations. That when you have dysfunctional parents that themselves are modeling a dysfunctional relationship, and that is your model for gender roles, that then you are actually yourself working to recreate, because in some sense that's what you're familiar with, or something like that. But usually it is actually more um, insidious than that, especially on behalf of the female. I mean, the women in situations of gender-based violence are, one can only describe them as the most willfully blind people in the world. That essentially the idea that they can sort of leverage social, I mean, this is why I think feminism is also incredibly toxic, because to make this a political issue rather than to make it a personal issue of personal maturity that needs to sort of be fixed on behalf of people in their private lives, in their own, to try to politicize this issue and turn it into a kind of a political siren call for action or something like that. I mean, this is the same way in which the Marxists have tried to leverage identity politics to bring down society and to promote politics of essentially that we need conflated moral solutions that apply to the system, because that's the only way to fix things. So when I watch the DA give this kind of play to these narratives of how you need to basically have a cultural revolution in order to deal with you need a political cultural revolution. This is the wrong level at which this kind of problem gets solved. It's completely the wrong level. The idea that you have politicians talking about social psychology, I mean, it just shows you the level to which the illiberalism has essentially infected us, the ideological illiberalism. And where is the spine to stand up against this kind of stuff and to draw some sane delineating lines that separate these things that need to be in separate boxes? Like the idea that politicians are like clinicians, are like psychologists, that they have a kind of role in terms of social psychology. This is part of the escalating illiberalism of demanding a kind of authoritarian or totalitarian, sort of political intervener and mediator between factions of the identity matrix. So when I watch the DA come up with these speeches in which they can use this as the foray in which that they can match the conviction of the Julius Malema, or they can match the moral sanctimoniousness of Eusebius Macaiser, I'm seeing a political party going in absolutely the wrong direction. That this kind of milk toast, this idea that you're just going to kind of make sure that you've got all your bases covered, that you're not sort of stressing the Overton window too much, I'm sorry, but you do need to actually become more astute to the culture war and to what's really at stake in the culture war. And we're not going to win back society by playing by their rules and by fitting into their narrative formula and by trying to outplay the game that they have set up to play. Then you're going to just be Musi Maimane talking to Eusebius Makaiser. You're going to be on the losing side because a real fascist is always going to outshine you in terms of their conviction of actually getting their hands dirty because they haven't already in principle conceded to the fascistic line, but then they hold themselves back for pragmatic reasons. They are a well-oiled, coherent um, voice for a political line that actually has its sentiment and it has its reasoning in line with and lockstep with one another. The DA is trying to be some kind of broad church, I guess. And look, okay, so I was listening to an hour-long exchange, which was essentially mediated by Nick. I hope I'm saying his surname correctly, Lormier. Excuse me, but sorry, Nicholas Lormier, and John and France Cronier, and sorry, I can't remember John's surname, but essentially the outgoing and the incoming COO, is it COO? Anyway, of the Institute of Race Relations. Now, I agree with a lot of their analysis. I'm going to disagree with them on their optimism, although I can understand why they need to be optimistic, and there are grounds for optimism. But Nicholas asked some questions that sort of look at these two problems or whatever for the burgeoning prospect of opposition parties to have a coalition to displace the ANC in 2024. Now, look, I agree with them that sort of that you can't that it makes more sense for the opposition parties to not be broad churches but to be um, more peculiar, more precise, and generate a very clear demographic or sorry, a very clear constituency to really sort of make themselves distinct and clear and transparent about their position. And I do think that I slightly disagree with them because I do think that you can still sort of aspire to be a broad church, although okay, I'm using now that word incorrectly in that, but you can only do so if you try to educate your a large an enlarged constituency that essentially you have to try to grow your constituency consciously, and you have to sort of do some kind of civic education. You have to try to bring people uh, to take people along with you, and that's what I think that the DA does need to do. I think that the DA, if it wants to aspire to have a greater footprint, it must it must actually create a compelling polemic, and it must take people into it, and it must generate a real kind of authenticity, a real kind of trust. Um, it must create a genuine kind of confidence in its party line, and so I do think that it would make more sense for it to break rank with some of to try to make a more sophisticated ideological case and and to use moral language as a unifying factor, because essentially, although some people might not like the esoteric analysis or something like that, but at least the sophisticated explanation would then be trotted out in arguments in ideological um, con- contestation in terms of ideological warfare against your adversaries, but then at least then you would have the merit developed in order to use the moral language in your slogans. So then you could say, in summary, you could say you could reclaim moral language. And I think that that's needed because we do need to reclaim the constitutional language. We need to reclaim non-racialism. We need to reclaim a lot of things that has been dirtied, that has been soiled, that has been broken apart. Um, and that, you know, you can only really do that if you start pointing at people and you say, no, you're paying hollow lip service to things that you obviously don't believe or that you never understood. So when Cyril Ramaphosa says non-racialism, he is talking with a forked tongue, half the time at least, and this is dangerous. So that's the part from the commentary of the IRR that I'll sort of cling on to and certainly try to emphasize and amplify that. Now, there is, I think, some depressing news about opposition parties trying to have a coalition. The problem is that I think both good, but certainly the Patriotic Alliance, are basically ideologically, they are the same as the ANC. They believe in racialist politics, or at least they certainly have no problem using identity politics and kind of some version of a kind of race nationalism. And to some degree, I think, especially in regards to the Patriotic Alliance, the Patriotic Alliance could almost be blamed on the DA. What I mean by that is that when Mmusi Maimane started playing the race card and started playing in identity politics, a lot of people in the Western Cape said, well, obviously the DA is trying to grow its party, it's trying to appeal to black voters by, doing the ANC light game. Well, we're screwed now. The only way that we're not going to be screwed is if we can create a voting bloc as a separate party that essentially tries to look after the interests of our voters, and we're going to then be a seat at the table if we're needed to make a majority. So the PA, the Patriotic Alliance, and both good, I think, have the same strategy, that they are there to be counted on by the ANC and to be bought off with special dispensation. They are there to be, that essentially, they will be there to shape policy that will essentially, the only common ground that they'll be able to find is that somehow they'll be able to team up against the same scapegoat, the same ideological scapegoat. And that they'll sort of try to divide up the booty, or of whatever extraction is going to be used against the ideological scapegoat. I mean, that's how identity politics works: is that you join hands together against a common enemy, and as long as you both agree that that person is the devil or that that person represents the devil, that's all you need to do, and so they can both agree in essentially the propaganda, the cultural propaganda that keeps the political framework sort of in vogue and keeps the now. The Patriotic Alliance, I think, did this, or they established themselves because the DA was no longer a non-racialist party, essentially, because the formula of non-racialism looked like it was dead in South Africa when Mmusi Maimane overtly plugged himself in to this new illiberal way of doing politics. Now, I do think that the DA needs to get on top of this more. obviously changing the direction of the party, which they have done, they have gone to great pains to try to extend a hand of friendship to Musi Maimane. Now, this I think is obviously, the DA is not treated well in the media, so no matter what the DA does, it would always be maligned. And they have tried to stay above the fray, especially in severing ties with these people that have different principles to them. And I mean, I don't know, maybe this has something to do with the nature of the party itself, that the party is not exactly owned by the leader, because the party is only owned by the leader in terms of what the federal conference agrees the mandate of the new policy direction is, or something like that. That the structure of the party itself is quite devolved, and therefore, on some, you know, yeah. So I mean, it. So I mean, I don't actually know all the details in terms of the limits at which the leadership can make grand ideological statements and frame things. But I do think that moral language has to be reclaimed, because at some point someone has to be able to survive Eusebius Macai's interview. And I'm not saying that the interview won't end in a complete in a breakdown, that is, because I do think that you're not actually possible. I don't think it should be possible to have a peaceful interview with someone with such disgusting morality. There are certainly virtuous gay people in the world. Eusebius Macai's is not one of them. This is a fascist. You can't. There's something wrong with you if you can sit down and be civil with a fascist, with someone who has such disgusting, illiberal, anti-constitutional sentiments. But and obviously any kind of moral problem that you would have with him, I'm sure he'll bring out lots of cards immediately. Oh, they love playing the sympathy grabbing, sympathy pulling, systemic oppression grift, and they can use anyone who doesn't agree with them as a blank canvas to project all manner of prejudice and things like that. And it's also very interesting, just um, how they award themselves this kind of, it really does destroy the relativism, sort of objectivity um, distinction. They really place themselves looking at any situation from an objective perspective. They don't notice that they're sort of making themselves the chairman of reality, making themselves the unilateral dictator over what things mean and what things are. And you see this when they set out their axioms, when they're quite bold about, well, these are my red lines, and their red lines are essentially guarantee them ideological superiority, because they're just basically that, well, you have to be on the side of the right identity faction because reality is fundamentally reducible to identity factions. They give themselves everything right at the start. And it's very tricky then when you are involved in in debating those kinds of people, because you're already very far away from the actual source of their toxicity, which is essentially all in their philosophical presupposition. It's hidden in their premises, and and they will often, I'm sure they'll play lots of games in which oh, you're not allowed to discuss my premises. My premises are my personal, private, moral sphere or whatever. So, you get to be on the receiving end of their sort of monotonous questions that all amount to essentially bullying you for not having the same racialist, disgusting sort of sentiments that they have. Um, anyway, I mean, and in some sense, the only way that you can really combat this is by bringing out psychological exposition as to why their whole worldview is fundamentally toxic and disempowering. That essentially they make it impossible for anyone to have self-esteem because they can only have self-esteem in the collective project of vindicating their identity, their group identity. So they have this like fundamental codependency with this disembodied racialist consciousness that has to sort of have a kind of ideological victory. And then in the precautionary measures that they're allowed to indulge in order to set up that ideological victory, they can then cover over themselves. The one hand washes the other hand. And they can always just kind of insulate themselves from having to actually answer, for the devastation and the corruption that their way of doing things, uh, 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 how it just fundamentally fouls up everything. Because it also makes everything, on their say so, everything is a representative or a token. Or they can unilaterally project on whatever part of reality that they want and make it part of their ideological narrative. And it always is very difficult to talk about these things because, in some sense, the best way to diffuse it is to come up with concrete, practical, or pragmatic mechanisms that they can't give proper attention to, that they have to overlook, that their ideology, through its moral conflating and its kind of necessity to condense everything into their oversimplified reduction of reality, they can't they can't offer basic answers to basic moral questions. They can't provide proper substantiation for living up to proper principles of a liberal, open, democratic society, of a constitutional system that actually has a proper moral worldview put into it that's actually capable of conserving itself and being reasonable and allowing providing to people a kind of even procedure in which that we can actually see what's going on in the world, that we can actually have clean, transparent politics. All of that is essentially fouled up by their self-awarded that their means are justified by their ends, so they can just kind of skip the actual procedure. They can skip the actual proper substantiation that would actually make it capable of being able to give diagnosis to what's actually going wrong. And to a large extent, you can see that these people, they have a kind of psychological problem. They have a kind of which they're projecting onto social psychology. They are trying to collect a kind of self-esteem from a collective destiny or a collective project that is shared in. So in some sense, it really is to sort of give up an internal locus of control and want to be part of some automatic bestowed prestige or status. And in some sense, all the problems with that basic narrative then get conveniently focused on an ideological scapegoat, so that something is representative of the thing that is the adversary to achieving all these great things. So there's only one problem in the system. It's white supremacy, or it's the patriarchy, or something like that. And so everything is condensed within a narrative of a systemic oppression. Now, like, this is uh, this social psychology political project. I mean, that's what totalitarianism always has been. That's what fascism is, essentially, and that's what these people are. That they are, and you can tell that they don't believe in libertarianism, or or it's part of their sort of gold at the end of the rainbow, that it comes afterwards. That you have to sort of break a few eggs in the meantime, and then you'll see everything that you want to see over the rainbow on the other end. Um, anyway, talking about this is not it's not the same thing as actually arguing with it in real time. But but the real problem is that they frame politics in such a way as to essentially make the solution not a political solution. They make it a cultural solution, and so in some sense they want politics to take hold of the culture and to control it directly. That they don't see that there's a distinction between the liberal order and people's personal private lives and freedom of expression, and that there is government. Somehow that these things are that the one is senior to the other, um, that the government is the paternal um, infantilizer of society. And that's really how they see the individual, is they see that the individual can only be given dignity if it is willing to take on the colors of an identity, and that identity must have a kind of political partisanship representation. It must have a political savior, a Führer, to represent its interests. And obviously, sort of responsibility and accountability in the individual all get dissolved in this conceptualization of politics. Um, and essentially, this devil has been let into the house by the Constitutional Court, that has already allowed essentially non-racialism to be radically redefined into oblivion. Non-racialism has essentially been defeated by inventing this concept of governmental prerogative, which has directly subverted the supremacy of the South African Constitution. Anyway, um, and the DA has been it says that they're going to ask for a referendum to have independent electricity, perhaps for the Western Cape, or independent policing. We should probably ask also for independent universities from the rest of the country, because uh, we need to stop the anti constitutional propaganda from its source, which is from this intersectional feminist proto fascism, essentially, with trying to turn everything into a systemic oppression narrative, so that it effectively never becomes solvable. It never becomes you can't attend to the solution, um, when you have it framed in such illiberal terms that dissolve the individual into a kind of factional identitarian faction and mass. Um, anyway, I yeah. So I mean, I guess maybe I'm you know, I really wish that there was an NGO that would start to develop some kind of civics education and a kind of that we need a kind of some kind of movement just for basic constitutional standards to be resurrected and recovered because they have been so badly damaged by institutional failure and corruption, institutionalized corruption, the moral corruption of the state. And you could call it ideological corruption as well. But there needs to be a focus made in prosecuting this ideological corruption and this institutionalized corruption of the Constitution. There needs to be a shadow public protector, or there needs to be some kind of NGO that is trying to actually at least document the gap to which that our institutions are failing us, and to which that they have been fallen into this corruption. Because we're not even having the full scope of the problem is not properly on display, as it were. And in some sense, we keep on getting boiled ever further into illiberalism because we have journalists like Eusebius McKaiser, who effectively, in my view, should be in jail for constitutional damages, for hate speech. Eusebius McKaiser has committed hate speech. He's committed constitutional damages. He is part of this campaign to undermine and subtract rights from the Bill of Rights selectively against people that he has an ideological gripe against. I mean, we cannot allow fascists to destroy the liberal order. I mean, if we don't care about our principles, then we don't deserve. Well, I mean, in some sense, that is the biggest problem that we have, in some sense, is that South Africa cannot afford its liberal values, and we needed to have enough growth, we needed to have enough development to which we actually had a proper civics education, and to which it actually became the entrenched ethos of the country. But that was essentially stymied, and that trend was reversed. And in the interim, what should have tided us over were the judiciary, where the judges should have been able to keep the cart on the road, to keep the train on its tracks. But the judges failed us. The judges betrayed the Constitution. They chose political partisan ideology, and they invented essentially a kind of, in the same way that the American system of government is corrupt, we imported a version of that, what I would generally call the Napoleonic corruption. Is that where you have the rule of man, you use democracy essentially to just keep on changing laws of general application so that you can keep on essentially escaping accountability, that you can just create more semantic sandcastles then to be doubled down and replaced by newer semantic sandcastles just to cover whatever it is that you're doing. And then you tell everyone that you have the rule of law, but it's not really the rule of law, because these are completely different models of the law, that you keep on inventing completely new structures of laws of general application. They're not the same laws of general application. They are radically unfolded into fit whatever the latest crisis is. And so we don't have a proper mirror to reflect to us accountability in the political sphere. We just have this moving goalpost, which is what essentially identity politics has, and affirmative action and black economic empowerment. The government has said, the judiciary has said that the government has a governmental prerogative to do what it wants with these things without proper review against constitutional inconsistency, because they've said, well, if the democracy assented to it, then it's consistent with the Constitution, because they invented this concept of a governmental prerogative to subvert the use of the sub-clauses in the limitations clause. Now, there is no excuse for that. I think that that should lead to a Nuremberg trials where we should actually, we certainly need to either impeach these constitutional judges, or we should have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but or we need to radically change the caliber of the people who are in these institutions, or if that's not politically possible, then I mean my alternative is that the Western Cape and maybe some other provinces should break up from the rest of the country, and we should establish our own constitutional court that doesn't have this kind of institutionalized corruption woven into it, and where we have a more non-political um, process of establishing judges that actually have the merit and the excellence to have an independent judiciary from the political structure. I'm just saying that because those are kind of just sort of extrapolated color. Those are just sort of rational consequences of the reasoning that I've already placed down, but there is perhaps a political version of expressing these points. But I mean, obviously would have to be framed in a very delicate sort of way. Um, and in some sense, I think that the best way to do it would be to have a shadow public protector making these kinds of assessments and making these kinds of reports, or making these kinds of press releases. That you would have political party that would fund a kind of shadow public protector, and that shadow public protector would try to raise these kinds of polemics. And because obviously the public protector is meant to have a kind of, is not meant to be a political partisan animal, but then is capable of making these kinds of broad oversight claims. And this is the kind of oversight that the DA is actually missing, because if the DA can't make these more far-reaching points, then it doesn't have the ideological foothold to make the more compelling partisan political points, because the framing of the system is so out of whack. The general lay of the land is so corrupted. And until you have a kind of baseline of what the actual legal framework should be, and the actual, we're so far out of, so I do think that you need to have a separate kind of spokesperson within the DA that can speak to almost these non-political points, critiquing the entire sort of structure of things. And perhaps even also leveraging their own court applications, for declarator orders and things like that, um, to try test the hypocrisy of the system, or at least to establish some kind of perhaps firewalls and some levels of protection within what is already a compromised and institutionally corrupted system, to start to plan out a way in which that these things can be cured or remedied. Um, but essentially, I mean, this doesn't stop the DA from making a political point against black economic empowerment and affirmative action in terms of how it's been promulgated. But this would lend another moral leg to it. That essentially this should not be a political fight. And making this a political fight is in some sense incredibly unfair, but also obviously plays into the hands of the racialist politicians. And that is the overarching polemic that needs to sort of be driven home. But it's not going to be driven home unless there's a second moral leg of the argument that this should already have been excluded from political debate. This should not have been on the table in the first place. The court should have taken this off the table in the first place. It's a derogation of the constitutional duty that the court had to uphold and to actually investigate if something is consistent or inconsistent with the Constitution, and they failed to apply the actual substantive clauses in the limitations clause. It's utterly disgusting. And they say that there's a governmental prerogative which is based on democracy itself. I mean, there's just so many things wrong with that. But also the fact that you could argue that Parliament itself is not democratically legitimate in terms of the eligible electorate and how little support it actually attracts. In terms of the amount of voter participation versus those who are eligible to vote. And in the interim, to let the Constitution languish as it has been left to languish in the shadow of this so-called democracy, so that essentially political power can be exalted at the expense and at the displacement of the Constitution's proper ambit as the supreme law of the land. Yeah, I mean, to see how the Constitution has been prostituted by our constitutional court, I mean, is a crime against humanity. It really is. I mean, these are people who I think in the round must be seen essentially as being just as corrupt, as morally inept and morally corrupt as the designers of the apartheid system, as the same people who try to also create a high court of parliament. I mean, this judgment about a governmental prerogative is in the same league as when Parliament, during the apartheid years, tried to construct a high court of Parliament to get around the judiciary. That we had a more integral, a judiciary with more integrity during apartheid than we do now is utterly disgusting, is an utter betrayal. And we have the best legal theory, the best legal tradition, the best constitution in the world, and how it has been hollowed out by these miscreants. There must at some point be some reckoning of this.